This is Research Like a Pro, episode 301, Research in Phases. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogist professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the authors of Research Like a Pro, a genealogist guide. With Robin Worthland, they also co-authored the companion volume, Research Like a Pro with DNA. Join Diana and Nicole as they discuss how to stay organized, make progress in their research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go! Today's episode is sponsored by newspapers.com, your go-to resource for unlocking the stories of your ancestors. Hi everyone, welcome to Research Like a Pro.
Hi Nicole, how are you today?
Great. You know what? Something fun I've been doing is I have been working on making a baby book.
Oh, well that's fun.
Which baby is it? It's for my third child, who's now 7.
Okay.
We're a little behind, but he was looking at some of the scrapbooks and family history books and baby books that we have, and I only finished the first 2 kids, and he said, "Mom, are you going to make one for me?" And so I said, "Of course, and you can help me." So we've been gathering up all the pictures and things. Most of our pictures are in Google Photos, but the ultrasound pictures were not, and I couldn't find them on my Google Drive or Google Photos, and I realized I had never scanned them, and they were still in the box with all the
Oh my
papers.
goodness. So are you doing this on a program online? How are you doing it?
Yeah, so the first 2 baby books I made were not online. I just printed the pictures and glued them in. But I asked Maxwell, which type of book do you want to do? And he wanted to make it online. So we're using Shutterfly, and he's helping me
Oh,
choose the
great.
theme, and we're putting in like different colors and things like that. So
That's so fun. And Shutterfly has a lot of fun little things you can add to your pages. It helps you make your book look really nice. So how fun. What a fun project. That's neat.
what are you up to?
Well, I've been doing a lot of work on my research project that I'm doing this fall for the study group. We'll talk about that later in the podcast, so I don't want to give anything away now about what I've been doing.
Great.
Well, let's do some announcements. We have our Airtable quick reference guides available on the website in PDF format. So one for using the basic Airtable research log and one for adding DNA to that. And then we have our Research Like a Pro webinar for April coming up. And if you're listening to this on the Monday it comes out, the webinar will be the very next day. So it's on Tuesday, April 16th at 11 a.m. Mountain Time. This is by our friend and colleague Alice Childs. She's an accredited genealogist, and she is talking about the parents of Maria Terwilliger in New York, a DNA case study. So I'm excited to hear Alice talk about that. She is accredited in New York as well as the other areas in the Mid-Atlantic. And then if you are thinking about joining us for a study group, our next Research Like a Pro study group begins the fall of 2024, and registration will open this summer. So you can start thinking about if you'd like to come on and work on one of your brick walls or just work on any project of your choice. And we do have a peer group leader application on our website, so we're always looking for peer group leaders. You get a free study group, and you get to be involved with a small group of people, and it's a great opportunity. And then, of course, join our newsletter for any coupons or deals that we have coming out. Upcoming conferences, you can see Nicole and I virtually at the National Genealogical Society Conference, which is in May. And we're very excited about that and new lectures that we are creating for that conference. And it will be just a really fun opportunity to learn from a lot of different researchers. So we have a listener spotlight today, and this is from Scott. He says, I noticed in the podcast RLP 294 Naturalization Records Part 3 that the example person you used, Mr. Solomon or Salmon, declared an intention to become a citizen on 7 April 1917. I did a lookup and saw that the U.S. declared war on Germany on April 6th, 1917. So he must have been highly motivated by events. Maybe by 1923, he was much less motivated with the war over. It was another outstanding podcast. I really enjoyed listening to your example. So thank you so much, Scott, for that little extra bit of research. That was so fun to learn that the U.S. had declared war, and then Adolph Salmon, our example, declared his intention to become a citizen the very next day. And what Scott meant was 1923, he actually never showed up to do his final oath of allegiance and never really received citizenship. So always fun to learn more little bits from the context.
I love that. Well, today we're talking about genealogy and DNA research in phases. And we've talked about this a few times. We talk about this a lot in our study groups, actually, because whenever people are working on setting up their objective for the study group, they're thinking about, kind of what they want to focus on and trying to find a manageable project size. So, this is really applicable if you've ever been working on a research question for a long time, many years, and you're kind of wondering, like, have I even made any progress? So we recommend that you look at your project as phases, and breaking up your complex research projects into phases can help you see the progress you've already made and plan future phases. For instance, researching the mother of a female ancestor born in the early 1800s is pretty unlikely to be finished within like a 20-hour research project that a typical professional genealogist might do. And so it will likely require several phases, and each phase would have its own objective. The overarching research question would probably be the same, to find the mother of that female ancestor, but each objective could have a different focus. So, as professional genealogists, this is how we approach many of the projects that clients ask us to research, especially with projects involving the use of DNA evidence. And because DNA evidence involves so much more work and more writing and more analysis, we do want to break that up into phases. Let's consider this example. The goal is to identify the mother of Elsie, born in 1820. The first phase's objective would be to conduct documentary research on Elsie, looking for clues that point to her mother's identity. And so this phase would involve building a foundation through documentary work and formulating hypotheses. And often a documentary research phase is recommended before starting into DNA analysis. So then the second phase could focus on researching Elsie's descendants and finding all of her children and her grandchildren and so forth to identify potential DNA test takers. And this phase is dedicated to extending the family tree and finding these people. Then the third phase could involve exploring the genetic networks of DNA testers to generate possible hypotheses. So this would be where you would make a network graph and analyze the graph and look at the connections between the clusters and look for the common ancestors of those clusters. Then maybe you find like a possible common ancestral couple. And so then the fourth phase could be to test that hypothesis. So in the fourth phase, you could look at different clues from DNA clusters that you found and see if they really do point to a family that actually existed in documentary records, not just in people's trees. And then looking to see if you have evidence for all of their children going down to the DNA matches. So this phase would involve a detailed investigation of that hypothesis. Then, if that phase didn't complete the research project, then another fifth phase could entail testing additional hypotheses. So it could take up to 5 phases to get closer to a conclusion, and even then, the answer might not be fully uncovered. But after completing several phases of research and producing research reports about each phase, you're in a good place to put the research on hold until additional documentary or DNA evidence is available.
Well, that was a great introduction to this whole idea of phases and such a good example. I think before we learned about this idea or understood how this worked better, we would just research forever and we never wrote reports. And so we never really knew exactly what we had. And we would just keep researching and trying to figure things out, kind of spinning our wheels. So this really has been a wonderful way to learn how to make progress. So let's talk about how to set up these phases of research. And the first thing you really need to do is define that research question you'd like to solve. So in our example, who was the mother of Elsie? This is an overarching research question, and then what we can do is make a bulleted list of possible strategies to implement. The first phase, we always recommend that you gather all of the documentary evidence for a person in a particular place and time. And then the next phase could involve following up on a hypothesized parent that you found in that first phase. And then if you didn't find any, perhaps it's one of those cases where the documents do not lead to any specific candidate for a parent, then maybe then the next phase would be finding DNA test takers, or perhaps you're going to have to do something like a land study or build and analyze a cluster chart or network graph. Then you'll have to really expand your ideas about what you can do next. After you have listed all those different strategies, put them in order. And if you're unsure of what order to use, you could just start working on phase one. So we realize that at the beginning, you may not be able to have your specific strategy completely nailed down. And so what I like to do is have a rough idea of how these phases might work, but then it will really depend on what you find in each phase, what you will do next.
Right. I think we wish we could just know exactly what we're going to do, plan the whole thing out. Same with the research plan. We want to know exactly which sources are going to be fruitful, which ones we don't need to check, but we do have to be flexible, right?
Absolutely.
Well, breaking projects into phases is effective, although we really just don't know how it will pan out at the outset. So it's okay to begin by defining the objective for the current phase and then adjusting it as new information emerges. So, just like with the research plan, as we start following the first step, we might find some new information that changes the next few steps. So, if, like in our first phase of research, we find a document that reveals a crucial record that then guides the next phase, we might decide for the next phase to use DNA to confirm what we found. Every project is a little bit different. And of course, each project will have varying degrees of success. And so, it's important to think about, whether a research project is concise or complex and consider the scope. If it's really complicated, we need to break it into phases. Some like simple projects would be like finding one biographical detail for somebody born in the 1900s. Like that could be a simple project depending on what it is and what records are available. And then more complex projects are the ones we typically would want to break into phases because we really want to find the answer, but we don't think we can do it all at once. And it usually involves like a time when there's less records available or there's some kind of complication, like we want to use DNA, but there's like endogamy involved. Pretty much anything with DNA, you should break into phases. So it just depends on the scope and kind of the complexity. And even something that seems simple might turn into a complex project. So we just have to be ready for whatever comes our way. So, when you write your research objective, you'll want to use key identifiers like full names, spouses, birth, marriage, death dates, and places. And to learn more about writing research objectives, you can listen to our second podcast episode. I think the first one was kind of an introduction, and then Research Like a Pro number 1 is about objectives. And then we've had several additional podcast episodes about writing research objectives over the years. So there's a few out there. But you can also look in our Research Like a Pro, a DNA book, because we do have a section in there about writing DNA objectives and talking about phases.
Right. We have developed this idea over the years, haven't we? As we have done our own projects and as we've worked with clients. So, as we develop this idea, we write about it and talk about it. And it's so fun to look back at how we originally started without even this idea of phases and how we've come so far in figuring out how to do these complicated projects.
Yeah, I will say that it makes it a lot more doable for difficult client projects to think of it in this way and realize that probably the first phase we will just barely get started with the DNA analysis, reviewing the documents. Whereas the second phase, you can really dive in a little bit deeper to understanding the network analysis and whatnot. So, yeah, it is cool to see how, as we've done a lot of research projects that incorporate DNA, we've kind of seen like a kind of more of a structure for the way the phases usually go.
Right.
Well, our sponsor today is newspapers.com. Discover your mom in the newspaper when you search newspapers.com. Find the stories that made her who she is today by searching the largest online newspaper archive. Newspapers.com makes it easy to find your mom, grandma, and others in the papers. Search more than 945 million pages from major news titles to small town papers. Uncover birth and marriage announcements, obituaries, photos, and much, much more. Explore papers dating back to 1690 or as recent as last month. Newspapers.com is used by millions of people every month for genealogy, historical research, and more. Find something you like with newspapers.com. It's a snap to save and share articles with family and friends or attach them directly to your ancestry tree. Use promo code FamilyLocket for a 20% discount on your subscription. That's code FamilyLocket and celebrate the stories of a lifetime with newspapers.com.
Well, I thought it would be fun to illustrate this whole idea of researching in phases by talking about my current project, which is Clemsy Cline.
Great.
And I am on my third phase, and it has been amazing to see how this is coming together. I'm really excited about it. And we're going to go through each one of the phases, and you can get just a really good idea of this research and why it was so difficult. And I am
Yeah.
using DNA.
This will be a good example because it is a challenging one with some of these things we have been talking about, like record loss and adding DNA, women, and
Yes. So we have, a few places on our family tree where we have a woman and we have no idea who her parents are. And for a long time, we have had this goal to figure out who Clemsy Cline's family is. And I had done a little bit of research, but I just didn't know what to do next. So here's my objective. The objective of this research phase is to discover a candidate for the father of Clemsy Cline. She was born about 1817 in Alabama and died after 1880 in Wise County, Texas. Clemsy married William Henderson Weatherford about 1839 in Arkansas. So that was what I had to begin with. And the first phase was really foundational. I wanted to discover a candidate by just looking at the documents. So I already had the 1850, 1860, and 18 censuses for Clemsey, and she was always a Weatherford in the records. But we had two children that had identified her maiden name as Cline in their death certificates. So that was our only clue we had for a candidate. So those censuses gave us a birth range of between 1817 and 1820 in Alabama. So I hypothesized her father would have been born before 1800, and I chose Virginia because the 1880 census does have her father as a birth in Virginia. Now, the 1850 census was our best clue because her household, the Weatherford household, is in Morgan County, Missouri. And right there on the same page is a Jacob Cline, and he's the head of the household, and he has two boarders in his household, a Mahala Cline, then he's got a younger child listed under Mahala. And so I would look at that over the years and think there's got to be some kind of a connection, but I'd really never done a detailed project on them. But I just felt like these two people could possibly be Clemsy's siblings. Jacob was born 1811 and Mahala 1828, so Clemsy just falls right in the middle of those two. Well, here's the other tricky thing, like you mentioned, Nicole, that the very earliest known location for Clemsey and Henderson Weatherford is in Izard County, which is severely burned county. So there are no probate, there's no marriage, there's hardly anything left that we would usually use. But I had federal land patents and the tax records had been sent to the state. And so those survived. So I decided just to look for all the Clines in Izard County and see if I could figure out who else could be there. And I discovered a John C. Cline and Mahala Cline and another John Cline and thought maybe this was Clemsy's family. So this project, I researched John C. Cline. I found him in the 1850 census of the neighboring county, Fulton County, and he was 65 years old, born about 1785. So I was excited to see he could be a possible candidate for the father of Jacob, Clemsey, and Mahala. And then I found that Mahala had married a man named Thomas Shockley in 1854 in Morgan County, Missouri, so right after that census. And I thought maybe, okay, is she the connecting link between the Izard County Clines and the Morgan County Clines? So I found some connections, but I still had a bunch of questions.
Yeah, you had found a lot of good clues, but nothing was really obvious, right?
Right. There was nothing that said for sure these are the siblings. They're just there on the same page in the census. And I should mention that in the 1850 census, that same one where they're on the same page, Clemsey also has two Cline children in her household that we could never figure out who they were. And they were younger children. So they were born in Arkansas, and several of her children were born in Arkansas. So we knew there was this Arkansas, Morgan County, Missouri connection.
Love that. It's so fun when you have little clues like that. Okay, there's like a family network here. It's not just this one Klein family in isolation like you sometimes see. You're like, okay, well, there's some kids here who have the same surname. Like maybe they could be cousins. Who knows?
Right, right. That first one did not have any DNA in it. It was really just looking at the records I already had, then creating a research plan to go try to find more. And so that was really helpful to find that whole little group of people of Clines in Izard County in the federal land patents and the tax records because I hadn't found them before. So that
Yeah.
was really good to find them.
Yeah, phase one was very effective. You not only established a foundation of documents and kind of like the fan club, but you've actually found some clues leading to some possible hypotheses of relationships of the Klein family.
Exactly. And it was great to know that John C. Cline was of an age to be the father. That was really helpful.
Yeah.
So, moving on to what I did next. So, the phase two objective was, as you might guess, was following those fans of Clemsey who each patented land in Izard County, Arkansas. And the dates were between 1844 and 1850. So, kind of in that sweet spot in the 1840s when Clemsey was still living there before she had moved to Missouri. Like I said, all of her children were born in Arkansas except for like a couple of the later ones. So I could really pinpoint her migration, which was about 1849. So I hypothesized this was all making sense. So I was going to explore John C. Cline, Mahala, she was known as Mahala Cline in the land patents, and then John Cline. So it makes it a little confusing when you have men of the same name. And I wasn't sure if I had John C. Cline Sr. or Jr. in the records. I knew there were two separate men because a John Cline who was younger shows up in Morgan County, Missouri in 1840, right next to Jacob Cline. So we have another connection there between these Clines. But then this other second John Cline does go back to Arkansas and patents land. So I really needed to try to study these three people and see if I could figure out more about them. So this second phase was all about land and tax, and I had ordered the land application files from the National Archives. So that gave me a lot more detail about when they specifically applied for the land patents because you have different dates, for when they apply and when it actually is finalized. And then I used the taxes. Oh, just did such a deep dive in the tax list. So let me tell you what I found because I made some amazing connections and it was so fun. So John C. Cline was senior and he first appeared in Izard County in 1837 and he applied for a land patent for 40 acres. So he has the first record there. And then that land patent was finalized in 1838 and he went on to patent two additional 40-acre parcels in 1838 and 1844. So he had a total land of 120 acres. And the tricky thing was Fulton County was created from Izard County. So then he became a resident of that county. So I had to look for tax records in both counties, which is always fun. But he did pay taxes on the Izard County land in 1839 and 1841. But he had sold that land by 1850. And the tax lists were such good information. They showed a George French paying tax on the land originally granted to John C. Cline. So I
Nice.
love that when the tax records tell you who the original grantee is.
That's so helpful. I wonder if they're using that to help them know where the land was because they're considering that as the location. Like, well, you know that land where John C. Cline originally lived? Well, now George French is there.
Maybe, but in the tax list, they still put the land description.
Oh, nice.
So you get both of those things, but that was very, very helpful in following this family. So it was interesting that John was taxed on town lots. So he sold his 120 acres and then he purchased two town lots, first just one and then two. And I don't have any record of those purchases because the deeds are all gone. Those records were
Mm.
destroyed. So often we will depend on the deeds to tell us what happened. But in this case, I didn't have that. Luckily, I had the tax records that gave me a clue. So I found John. He was headed a household in 1850 in Fulton County, and that household had a female by the name of Milky, and then it had about four children. And so I hypothesized, okay, are these maybe a second family? These would be really young children. I mean, these would be way too young for this to have been Jacob and Clemsey and Mahala's mother having children. This would not work. This had to be a second family with perhaps half siblings.
Oh,
So that was something that I thought of.
what was the name of the woman again?
Milky, Milky. Yeah.
That's new. Fun.
Yep. So then we come to John Cline Jr., and he was so tricky to nail down. He had paid a poll tax in Izard County in 1839, but then he was up in Morgan County by Jacob Cline in 1840 in the census. But then he's back in Izard County in 1847 and 1848 applying for land patents. And those patents do state his residence is Fulton County and Pulaski County. And of course, then I go to Pulaski and research there, and there were no records for him in Pulaski whatsoever. So that must have been just a short little stay there. But the tax lists do reveal his death by 1849, which I was so surprised at. When I first saw that, I had assumed it was John Cline Sr. that died. He was the older man. So
Oh,
the only way I figured it out was by tracing the land. I had to look at all the land descriptions to figure out who this was that died.
did the tax records say junior and senior on them?
Occasionally they did. And in one instance, it was incorrect. And the only way I figured it out was looking at the land descriptions again. The federal land patents sometimes said senior and sometimes didn't. So it was really tricky because sometimes John C. Cline was John C. Cline, other times he was just John Cline. So I literally made tables of those land descriptions and sorted out these two men based on those.
Good job.
It was confusing and tricky. So here's a really interesting thing. So John Jr. had died by 1849, and Absalom Wiseman was listed as the administrator for his estate. And as we know, an administrator means that he died without a will and he was young. And so he probably just had an accidental death or got ill and died suddenly. But Absalom Wiseman pays the taxes on his land that he had patented, and then a Sally Cline paid the tax for one of the land parcels in 1852. So now I have another woman, and I'm hypothesizing maybe that was his wife. And then a Sarah Blair paid the tax for the other two. And by 1843, an Irvin Blair paid the tax for the two parcels, and we don't hear any more of Sally Cline or the other parcel. So it sounds like that land was sold to the Blairs. But what about this Sally Cline? Well, I had to look for her. I found a Sarah Cline in the household of F. Heron in Fulton County, and I felt like she could be the widow of John, who had died in 1849. And she had twins in the Heron household. She had these two twins who had been born in 1848. So I again hypothesized that perhaps Sarah and these twins were the wife and children of John Jr., who had died. And maybe she had three other children that she sent north to Morgan County to live with Clemsey and Jacob Cline, who would have been their aunt and uncle. Because I've always tried to figure out who are these children that show up in Morgan County.
That is a really interesting guess.
Well, we know that they all end up there in 1850, and I know that Clemsey moved about 1848, 1849. So it kind of makes sense that if her brother John had died and he had these three older children, and Sarah had just had twins, that, she's going to keep the twins, but those older children, maybe she sent them north. So
Wow. Yeah.
that was a fun find. And I traced those twins forward, and they were living with a Ferguson heron in 1860. And by then they're going as herons. And Sarah is not in the household, and I could not find her anywhere. So I wondered if she had died.
Wow. And probably someone today, a descendant of those people, is trying to find their ancestors.
I know, trying to figure out who are the parents of.
Right? If it's a, like, DNA project and they can't find any heirs past a certain
Right.
point, and they're like, "Why not?"
Right. And there are two other younger girls in the household by 1860, and maybe those are more daughters of Sarah. I don't know, because maybe she married again. I don't know, or other relations to Ferguson Heron. So that kind of, I stopped with that part. But I finally have a hypothesis for those children that end up in Morgan County, which was good because, I just couldn't figure out where they came from.
For sure, that could be the explanation for that.
Right. So then we go to Mahala, and Mahala, as I said before, she shows up in 1850 in the household near Clemsey, and she's living in the household of Jacob Cline, who I think probably is a brother. And the interesting thing about Mahala is she was also born in Alabama, like Clemsey. So I thought, okay, there's another connection.
Mhm.
And I found Mahala applying for land patents as a young woman, which you don't often see. And she applied in 1844. And in 1850, we see that a George French is paying tax on her land that was originally patented by her. So again, we don't have deeds to see when she sold that land, but now we have George paying taxes on it. So she had likely moved north to Missouri by 1850. And she was the same Mahala Cline who was in that household of Jacob Cline with the younger Robert, age 5, who I think maybe was John Jr.'s son. And then she gets married to Thomas Shockley in 1854.
Mhm.
So I can just picture this little caravan of Clemsy Cline, Weatherford, and Henderson Weatherford, and then Mahala, all, going up to Morgan County. Jacob Cline is up there and established. He'd been there for quite a while and settling there for a bit.
Yeah.
So anyway, there's my hypothesis. So my question was to discover a connection between the Missouri and Arkansas Clines. And so that really did result in this hypothesis that John C. Cline Sr. was the father of Jacob, John Jr., Clemsey, and Mahala. So nothing so far disproves that hypothesis. And finding that John Cline Jr. had died by 1849 gives me another little piece of evidence that those three Cline children in the 1850 households of Clemsey and Jacob Cline could be the children of their brother, John
Yeah.
Cline Jr.
You convinced me. I think it's completely true.
Well, it was really fun doing the land and tax. It was the tax records that just really helped. I only had land tax and the census, so that really helped. So now I'm on to phase 3, which is what I'm currently working on, and I am testing that hypothesis of John being the biological father. Doing the research on him, I only have him in the 1850 and 1860 censuses, and it gives him a birth of about 1785, and we've got a Pennsylvania or a Virginia birth, depending on which census. And then he dies, don't know when he dies, but he is in 1860, he is out in Texas. So that's where I have him. So that's going to be part of my documentary work, is to search the Texas records for where he died. I don't know if there will be anything for him there, but my main focus is DNA this time. And here's an exciting thing. I have a network graph that found a really good cluster of Clines, and within that cluster are some descendants of Mahala Cline Shockley. Isn't that
Yay.
great? And even more exciting, I have found some descendants of John C. Cline with that family who I think are half siblings.
Oh, with Milky and her children.
Yes.
Nice. Well, I love her name, and this family has fun names. We have Clemsy Cline, we have Milky Cline.
Mahala. Yeah, so it's kind of fun. And of course, looking at the online trees, people have really mixed up the records on John
Oh
Cline.
yeah,
They have got that just so convoluted.
I bet.
But I just found with the full text search on Family Search's new Searching for Deeds, I just found a deed in Sangamon County, Illinois for John and Milka Cline.
Ooh,
Uh-huh. So that is like before they went to Arkansas. So I think it was 1836, 7. And the other tie to Sangamon County is that their older son, Jesse Cline, joins the Army and gives his birthplace as Sangamon County, Illinois.
nice. Don't you love it when you can see all the puzzle pieces just coming into place and you're like, I finally have this family?
Yes, yes. So I haven't done my research plan yet for the DNA study group, but you can bet it's going to take place in Sangamon County, Illinois, and Texas because I now have some bookends for
Yes.
John C. Cline's life. And I'm pretty sure he didn't start out, in Sangamon County, but that's my next location pushing him back. And what I really want to find is a connection to Alabama, where those girls, Clemsey and Mahala, say they were born. So
Wow, yeah.
if he did do Alabama to Illinois and then to Arkansas and Texas, oh my gosh, he reminds me of Benjamin Cox. He's a man that just moved all over the
This
place.
very long migration path in their life. And you would think they would stay either like in the north or the south, because like around that time is the Civil War when everyone is like either associated with the south or associated with the north. But then you have some of these people who just migrated all over the place.
Right. Well, and Arkansas and Missouri were interesting because you could be either or there.
Those are the border states, yeah.
You had both. And Texas was the same way, going out to Texas. So really interesting. But I am very excited that the DNA is starting to provide evidence that my hypothesis is correct, that this is a family for Clemsey, and that the DNA is showing it, which is really cool. I love the network graph because Clemsey had a lot of children who had a lot of children. So
Oh,
we have many, many people who have tested that come through her line, and they all connect also, which is the value of a network graph. They all connect to these other Cline descendants. So that's pretty cool. It's not just me, it's not just my test taker, it's like a whole cluster of people connecting, which is what we want.
right. Yeah. You want to have multiple descendants of your research subject connecting to multiple descendants of your hypothesized sister or whoever. That's really good. Well, this has been so interesting to hear the phases of research in the Klein project. So, to summarize, you started with phase one, setting a foundation in documentary research, and you actually found some clues that led to a hypothesis of a family to connect to. Then in phase two, you dove even deeper into land and tax records and found a lot of connections in the documents. And then phase three has been testing the hypothesis you found in phases one and two with DNA.
Absolutely. And I'm hoping to continue the documentary work and find even more connections and more clues. So it's really fun to look at this ancestor that for so long I had no idea what to do with her, and to now actually have some really good ideas about her family.
Well, I hope to see this in an article in the NGSQ someday. So good job.
Yes,
And
that was
that'll
great.
be fun to see what comes out of this third phase. And like you said, it's not just a DNA phase because it just goes so hand in hand with documentary research. When you find, a hypothesis and you find a connection in DNA, then you have to go back to the documents again to figure out more about the connections in the documents. So it's kind of a ping pong game back and forth.
Absolutely. I would have had no idea about the Shockley connection without really taking a look at Mahala and then looking at John C. Cline. You have to research those people so well so that when you see their descendants in the DNA matches, they jump out at you, or you look at their tree and you go, oh, okay, now I know who you are. But until you do that work, you really just have no clue who these people could be.
Right. Well, thanks for sharing your example. And I hope that all of our listeners will try doing their research projects in phases and kind of conceptualizing them this way to help reduce the overwhelming feeling that you're continually working and never finishing. So the idea of doing research in phases or blocks of research is not a new concept, but it's usually just used by professional genealogists who are researching for clients. But I think it really can be used in our own work as well to help us to make progress and to better research like a pro.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening. We hope you have a great week, and we will talk to you next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your research. If you want to learn more, purchase our books, Research Like a Pro and Research Like a Pro with DNA on Amazon.com and other booksellers. You can also register for our online courses or study groups of the same names. Learn more at familylocket.com/services. To share your progress and ask questions, join our private Facebook group by sending us your book receipt or joining our courses. To get updates in your email inbox each Monday, subscribe to our newsletter at familylocket.com/newsletter. Please subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. We read each review and are so thankful for them. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.